Thank you very much. Christian Mersman, Global Donor Platform for Rural Development. We all know that the imports from outside Africa into Africa are large. The Economic Commission of Africa talks about something like 40 billion US per year. So to say, the vulnerability of Africa because of those imports and because of lack of food, not security, but food sovereignty, I think this is very clear and straightforward. And secondly, I think there was also talk about the import tariffs. We all know that the ministers of finance rely on the income, domestic income of food import tariffs, which is, so to say, a constant budget line in their budgets. So I think, if we really would move forward and make, for example, Africa less vulnerable, is to substitute imports for 40 billion or whatever, what the WTO calls now the regional integration, which means basically trade within Africa, within the countries, supplying local markets, particularly urban markets. So how do you see the trend towards the substitution of imports into Africa, particularly for staples, in the near future?
Thank you. Next. In the middle over here.
Jim Woodhill from Foreign Affairs and Trade in Australia. I was wondering if the panel could reflect a little bit on the responses you've seen by the G20, and in that context, who should be driving some of the measures to put in place the sort of mechanisms that you're talking about to tackle price volatility?
Good, Jim. Thanks. Any further questions down the front? Sorry, you guys having to run around a bit.
I'm Lilian Fulginiti from the University of Nebraska. Kim, you showed a graph in which you have the price of the biofuels prices go up, and at the end of the period you had commodity prices really following it. I understand that commodity prices stay there while fuel prices went down. Do you have anything to say about any potential of structural change in the commodity market that might have kept the commodity prices up?
Good question. They did drop a little bit relative to grain prices, but anyway, we'll give the panel a chance to respond to that. Yes.
Emily Albert from Agriculture for Impact. I was wondering if the panel thinks that we've learned any lessons from the 2008 food price crisis and whether or not we're prepared as a global community to respond to a potential food price crisis.
Yes, thank you. Maximo did ask the question also of what should be the first priority for governments, that is, what can be done to avoid these volatile prices in the first place, and then the secondary question is, well, if we do have them, what can we do to mitigate the consequences? So let's try and keep both those things in mind. Yes.
On Asphalt from FAO. I just have got a brief question. In the recent IPCC report, they kind of documented the impact of climate change on the fourth dimension of food security, and they claim that climate change does have also impact on increase in price. I'm just wondering whether there is systematic evidence that shows, with the exception of 2008, where there is extreme events affect the price, whether any very systematic scientific evidence in this relationship between price increase and climate change.
Okay. Thank you.
I think that there are some comments that you made, Maximo, that made it implicit that some of the US-based economic shocks that took place around 2007, 2008 probably had some impact as well on price volatility. But what specifically do you think, if there was such an effect, what specifically do you think those causes were?
Good. So I've had one question about the G20. Nobody's asked questions about what role the WTO might be able to play in this game.
Thank you. I'm Deraje from IFPRI. I'm wondering, most of the smallholder agriculture are the main suppliers of the food production and of these consumption goods. And I do believe that since they are producing primary products, the global governance of these agricultural commodities is bear-driven. So do you think that an appropriate insertion of the farmers in the chain can stable the price volatility?
Okay. Should we go back to our panel for a moment? Ralph, do you want to have a go?
All right. Let me take this opportunity to say South Asia Association for Regional Cooperation. We have a food bank, and the Economic Commission of West African States. In addition to the ASEAN Association of Southeast Asian Nations, +3 Emergency Rice Reserve. All right. Let me start with the question on have we learned from 2008. Then I'll go back a little bit to some of the earlier questions about the reserve. I don't think we've learned our lesson, because if you listen closely to what Maximo mentioned a while ago, the triggers of that price increase, the escalators, were trade policy actions. But what was the response? Regional reserve, and where's the policy? So there were some inklings of that. G20 has a rapid response forum. And even in the ASEAN, they started actually it was first to start a rice trade forum. Now it's a food trade forum. And I think that's exactly what countries should latch upon and sort of develop and mature into possibly codes of conduct or some mandatory, at least some mandatory consultative mechanisms before they impose unilateral food trade policies. Now, understandably, this is difficult to do because each country wants to maintain its sovereign control over its food markets and spare its own population and insulate it from global markets. But then, I mean, that thinking has to be contrasted with the whole centuries of integration that we live in a unified world now, and the actions of one country cannot be taken in isolation of its possible consequences on the rest. So I think moving towards that, if we want a world where we have more and more of 2008, then we can keep on the status quo of isolationist type reactive policies. But if we want to avoid it, if we have learned our lesson from that, then we should move into a more multilateral approach towards food security policies. I think Kim enjoyed hearing that. About the food price and the crowding out, I think these reserves are more of a practical issue. So the stocks are on hand, then you have a crisis. However you want to procure the stocks for the food safety, well, it's already there, it's on the pipeline, why not use it? Of course, once it's depleted, then you have the question of how to procure additional stocks. Then you have all of these additional operational or practical questions. So the advantage of the reserve is ex post, it's already there, rather than having to run to the market and to do it in the case of the emergency. For the global price, and also as a qualifier to what Maximo asked, crop damage is the actual trigger for the emergency reserve release. Certainly weather or pest infestation or any other reason might be a cause of such crop damage. Now, remember, this is a +3 arrangement. Actually, the bulk of the stocks, remember 787,000 tons. Only 87,000 tons came from the ASEAN. 700,000 came from the +3. So if you think about that, there might be some leeway for the better off members of the ASEAN +3 to be able to support the food deficit countries of that scheme, even in the face of global price shocks, because some countries are more able to afford such releases. Can I have one last about the speculation, although it's not directly related to my topic? That's well and good. I think the connection is undeniably there, but financialization of food markets is neither necessary nor sufficient for extreme price volatility. Look at the physical markets. The rice market, that was purely a physical speculation. That is probably unrelated to financial speculation, because the futures, the financialized portion of that market is very small, very thin. So what really drove the price increases in the case of rice were actually good old physical hoarding that has been with us since time immemorial. So it's not necessary, nor is it sufficient, because there are any number of relatively less well-known commodities markets which, despite many decades of being in having a futures market, financialized status, have not exhibited dramatic episodes, or at least have demonstrated only very rarely.